to welcome Christian Baines to the podcast. Christian was born in Queensland, Australia, and has lived in Brisbane, Sydney, and Toronto, earning an MA in creative writing at University of Technology, Sydney along the way. His musings on travel, theatre, and gay life have appeared in numerous publications in both Australia and Canada. A passion for travel has sent him chasing dark and fascinating stories around the globe. His first novel, The Beast Without, was released in 2013, followed by his erotic short story, The Prince and the Practitioner. His second novel, Puppet Boy, was released in 2015, and his most recent, The Orchard of Flesh, which is the sequel to The Beast Without, was released in August. Christian, welcome.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks so much for getting on my to-read list with Orchard of Flesh. You mentioned that book as we started talking about having you on the show, and I so much enjoyed it, and I don't usually do paranormal for one reason or the other, but it caught me. Tell our listeners about the Arcadia Trust series and about this new book.
Okay, well, the Arcadia Trust is basically an urban fantasy series that grew out of, or the first book at least grew out of basically an erotic short vampire story that I found I really liked the character voice of. And it kind of just blossomed into this sort of, I guess, old school urban fantasy from the perspective of this vampire, and fixed on this much younger, much less stable werewolf who he's been asked to investigate for a series of murders in the first book. And the organization that's conscripted him to do that is the Arcadia Trust, which is a collection of supernatural beings living in Sydney in Australia, under the leadership of a human Patricia Backer, who is a former nun whose parting ways with the Catholic Church hasn't yet been fully explored and divulged. And the second book, The Orchard of Flesh, it continues. The lead vampire, Raylan, his relationship with the werewolf Yorgos becomes complicated in the kinds of ways that get you on podcasts like this one. And The Orchard of Flesh continues their relationship. It continues Raylan's relationship with a human servant he acquires in the first book. I'm not going to say who it is. And it continues his relationship with the Arcadia Trust and various secondary characters' relationships with each other. Basically, I like big casts. I like rich worlds with a lot of different characters and agendas to explore. So it's kind of what I've strived to create with both books, and what I'm hoping to do with them going forward.
Do you have an idea for how many books will be in the series?
We're probably going to look at 5 or 6. I find 6 is my usual point with the series where I start to check out personally. So I think that's going to be a good number to tell the story I've got in mind at this stage. Mm-hmm. But who knows? It's a little way off yet.
Now, you mentioned that there was a short story that was kind of at the inspiration for this. What else kind of played into the development of this world?
A whole lot of stuff. I kind of went through a phase about 10 years ago of really just... I had always sort of been loosely aware it was out there, but I hadn't really read any urban fantasy. I'd been more interested in sci-fi and thrillers and that sort of various other genres. And I started getting into urban fantasy right about the time some of these series, Laura K. Hamilton, Charlene Harris, were starting to not really hit sort of mainstream consciousness, but certainly get out there and get up to about their 4 or 5, maybe half dozen book mark. It really just kind of escalated, and I just started to find influences both in kind of new media around modern takes on monsters and like classic Gothic novels as well. And so I just started to think about, okay, what if you brought versions of those characters without literally using those characters, which seems to be a popular thing to do now, from the Victorian era into a modern day setting. So there are all kinds of influences in those books, but really yeah, I have kind of a couple of year long romance with urban fantasy to thank for them coming out.
You call this urban fantasy, and I was calling it more paranormal. Where does paranormal include urban fantasy? Or are there lines kind of that draw between what paranormal is and where urban fantasy is?
Uh, I don't mind the label paranormal. I I tend to resist the label paranormal romance. So even though there is a romance that's significant and it runs through the book, well through both books, it romance is a very distinctive genre, and unless you are hitting certain beats that belong to that genre, your book is not a romance. So I tend to resist that label unless I've actually got a product that I think
Mm-hmm.
fits those beats. And to date, I don't. I've not written what I'd consider to be a romance novel.
Yeah.
Um, but I think urban fantasy and paranormal, I don't really mind where people want to draw the lines for defining those.
And I would agree that this was not a paranormal romance in my view either. There is, as you stated, the romance, but it does not hit those beats
Mm,
for sure. But I enjoyed the romance element that ran through it for
mm,
sure.
mm.
Uh, how did you plan out your take on the vampire, the werewolf, and the supernatural characters to make them your own without, drawing on some of the other things that we've seen authors do to the traditional archetypes for these characters?
I Well, like I said, a lot of my early reading was I read a lot of science fiction. I read a lot. I Most of what I learned about character interaction and dialogue, I can probably trace back to, shows like Star Trek and Babylon 5 and shows with those large ensemble casts, but also shows with a very good and strong sense of mythology and a very strong sense of how to deliver an overarching story slowly. Um, so I In the way that it's distinctive, I've kind of taken a little bit of a sci-fi angle, insofar as there is no magic as such in this world. Magic is just science that has either been kept from you by other people or is yet to be explained. Um, and all of the supernatural creatures pretty much have a sense of who they are and why. The vampires who are known as bloodshades in this universe, they tend to think of vampire as summoning images of Christopher Lee or whatever. So they tend to resist that kind of label, but they are naturally born as they are. They do not go out recruiting. They do not turn people they meet to procreate themselves. They are a recessive gene through the family lines, as are werewolves, as are cloak walkers, who are people who gradually start to vanish around late puberty, early 20s, which is when all of these abilities start to kick in. So it's really just moving things across to a slightly more scientific base, so you can then play with science tropes, which I find an awful lot of fun. It definitely takes me back to some of my influences as a writer for sure.
How much overall planning did you have to do before you actually started to write? Or did you evolve your world just as you were writing?
Pretty much evolved it as I was writing the first one. I was doing sort of notes that have been revised and scrapped and abandoned and changed endlessly while I was writing the first one. I mean, it's constantly evolving. I'm constantly flip flopping between ideas, whichever is going to give me a stronger effect, but also an effect that's going to feel like it has a payoff later down the road.
Mm-hmm.
I like having people who I like giving people who've sort of are moving from book to book a sense that they're sort of being rewarded for staying with the story. As in addition to just keeping everything quite cohesive, you can pick up Orchard of Flesh and it'll make perfect sense to you. It lays out perfectly well without having read Beast Without. I think it you'll cop a few spoilers for sure, but having said that, it's if someone wants to stay through the entire series, then I like to have a few rewards in there for that.
Yeah, and you're 100% right about that. I picked up Orchard of Flesh, had not read Beast Without, and didn't feel like I missed a beat.
That's good.
I dropped right in, went on, and now I'm eager for book 3, and I will also go back and pick up book 1 just to see what I missed back there. So yeah, I mean, people could kind of. I like that you could drop in anywhere, but then you just pull right through. Uh, Puppet Boy, which I have not read, seems very different from the Arcadia Trust books, just based on its blurb.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us about that book, since it's your former recent release from just last year.
Yeah, Puppet Boy is a very different book in that it completely sheds any sort of fantasy elements. There is nothing supernatural going on in Puppet Boy. It is still set in Sydney, um, and it's set in around a fairly elite, wealthy North Shore Sydney high school. Um, and it's focused on a senior kid who wants nothing more than to be a film director. And he has a kid transfer to his class who wants nothing more to be an actor. Um, Now, okay, if this was another type of book, then it all sounds like a very oh my goodness conflict here, and we all end up happily ever after going to the formal or whatever. Not really going to work that way. This one, well, first of all, Eric, the lead character, has a girlfriend already, who he's been with for a good, I think, 6 or 7 years by within the timeline of that book. So since they were quite young, she has a damage of her own going on, and there is a question as to who is using who in this book, and um, just to what extent these kids are willing to go to realize their various ambitions, and how good an actor is Julian. And then you have a couple of other plot lines. It's like, what's with Eric's uh, seeming night job as an escort to the middle class to wealthy socialites of Sydney? What's with the guy? He's the burglar. He's got tied up to a chair in his absent mother's theatre room. So you have these plots that any of them would make a great premise for his first movie. Unfortunately, they are his real life that he has to try and resolve while kind of sussing out this new guy who's arrived in school. Um, so I had someone tell me that that it made Cruel Intentions look like Sweet Valley High,
Wow.
with some of what was going on. I don't think it's quite as campy as Cruel Intentions. I was looking at writers like Bret Easton Ellis and books like Less Than Zero, mixing that with elements of kind of classic high school movies like Breakfast Club or what have you, with a little bit of a David Lynch type. We're not entirely sure what we're reading, whether it's how reliable it is or how much we're being sold as a fantasy here.
Interesting.
Which is it's a hell of a book to try and pitch in an elevator, um, as you've probably worked out from hearing me ramble now. Um, but yeah, it's very far removed from the fantasy worlds. It's much more general fiction. It's definitely not YA, although I've had a few people sort of sell it that way.
Mm.
Um, there's some quite surreal, quite dark stuff in there, and it's probably been the most fun I've ever had writing a book of any kind, and the people who do like it have really loved it. And Beast Without had sort of a broader range of readers and kind of a generally positive response. Puppet Boy, far more polarizing, but the people who love it really love it. So, I mean, that's really, you know, really encouraging for me.
You really hit some interesting beats on that for me, because you tied Bret Easton Ellis books, of which I'm a fan,
Mm-hmm.
to like The Breakfast Club, because I'm also a fan of the John Hughes movies, and
Yeah,
those are generally two things that don't go together
you would
typically.
think not. You would think not.
And then you layer a little David Lynch in there too, and depending on what era
Hmm.
of Lynch you're talking about, that's interesting too.
Yeah, yeah. It's really a mixed bag of sort of these are a few of my favorite things, and kind of seeing what I ended up with. It I mean, it evolved out of a pretty generic, pretty dull high school coming out story that I abandoned about a quarter of the way through when I realized that story had been told about 50 times already. And I just wanted to get into something that about young people who, in one way, were very charismatic and you kind of want to hang out with these people, and on the other hand are wildly amoral and disturbing, and you do not want to be anywhere near these kids. And so it is a bit of a few, and because they are artists and they are all lovers of film and theatre and illusion, it let me really play with contrasts like Bret Easton Ellis to the John Hughes films and that sort of thing. So, like I said, it's probably the most fun I've had with any story I've done.
Now, how did you decide to drop this book between the two Arcadia Trust books?
It was ready.
That works.
Pretty much. That was what There was quite a gap between Beast Without and Puppet Boy, and I'd started Puppet Boy because I had no idea if Beast Without was going to sell. I was trying to pitch it to mainstream publishers and go through agents and all that sort of thing, who did not want to look at a gay book on this topic. I literally have a rejection letter in my drawer from an agent saying these books are sold to young women. You must have a young female protagonist who must be human. Like, okay, I'm guessing you don't read a lot of these books, but it was fine. She was very, very polite about it, but that was her line. So I started, and I read everything. I am not limited to any one genre. I get bored if I'm reading one genre for too long. And I really just wanted to play with the general fiction book and kind of have a bit of fun with a high school setting, because like a lot of people, many millions of people before me, I absolutely despised high school. So I wanted to kind of reimagine it the way I would look at it. Something like Glee is not how I idealize my high school years. If that's you, go to it. That's way too, upbeat and preppy for my taste. So yeah, I just kind of built these characters who I could empathize with, absolutely. And they do have a moral compass, but it's very, very skewed. So I worked on that alongside Orchard of Flesh. Once I worked out that Beast Without was actually going to go somewhere. But yeah, the timing was not really deliberate particularly. You've got two strands of me, whichever you'd prefer to follow, or both. Both would be great. Both is always great.
Right. Yeah.
But they pick up a different readership for, I think, reasons that are apparent. Some people cross over, and but they're very different styles of book.
You mentioned you tend to read many genres. Do you have favorite genres that are like your go-tos?
Difficult to say. Look, I most of what I read would be gay fiction, and I don't think there is anything. I really don't. I really make no apologies for that. I think about all the straight authors who would never pick up a gay book in their lives. So, well, but I don't know. I really don't have any particular genre that cries out to me. I try to come back to urban fantasy semi-regularly, just to keep my hand in and to keep sort of I guess it trains my mind back to the Arcadia Trust books and sort of keeps that flowing a little bit. And I personally just enjoy it, whether that's LGBT or otherwise. I like books that are going to tease my mind a little bit. I like darkly comic sort of books. I like angry queer books as well. And there's a lot of authors kind of from sort of maybe a generation ago who write from a place of very strong resentment for the world, and I find some of their work really, really interesting to go back to, and just very energizing in a way that may not be entirely positive, but energy is energy regardless. So they're just they're and it's very interesting to get a much more cynic, that insight from a more cynical time as well.
Mm-hmm. What about author inspirations? Are there authors that you kind of go to as inspirations to your own work?
Um, I don't know if I have specific authors as such. I more just sort of cherry pick from various authors. I mean, anyone who writes vampire books in this day and age and thinks they don't have a debt to Anne Rice is naive or lying. There's only one place I've been asked that question where I didn't credit Anne Rice, and that was sitting on a panel with her son 2 chairs away from me, and I didn't want to look like a gushing fanboy. So I have no idea if he thinks I'm the most arrogant, un, ungrateful guy out there. I have no idea. But no, she was definitely a big influence in terms of bringing those kind of characters and those creatures into a modern setting. I think pretty much all of urban fantasy, can draw from that. In terms of the tone, particularly of the Arcadia Trust books, like things like the Dresden Files books, Laurel K. Hamilton to an extent, probably earlier books in that series maybe. Simon R. Green, who's a fantastic British urban fantasy author. His books, they kind of skirt a line between like classic gumshoe urban fantasy and really high camp, over the top. You're sort of reading this going, oh my God, has Ryan Murphy read this? Sort of, seeing where it can go. We've got drag queen superheroes charging through fields of zombies in a convertible to save the hero from whatever, stuff like that. Getting away from genre. Bret Easton Ellis, again, big literary hero of mine. With Orchard of Flesh, actually, Clive Barker and David Cronenberg. Clive Barker as a writer, David Cronenberg as a filmmaker. It's very much a book about, using various aspects of people and bringing them together, and to what level is sort of cooperation a reasonable goal. Because we're bringing together, all these various species, and there's a lot of distrust in the air. There's a lot of political agendas going on, and there's another character who has a very different idea of what it means to bring species together. So, yeah, I love Clive Barker's earlier books that are very, very graphic, very, very, very confrontational, and bringing those ideas out, and David Cronenberg's movies as well. So there's an aspect of body horror that's much stronger in this than it was in Beast Without.
Very good inspirations. And now that you've mentioned those kind of things, I can see that in some specific scenes from within Orchard of Flesh, how that kind of all connected together there too. So you're headed to GRL in October in Kansas. Is it your first GRL? I think it is, because I don't think I've seen you there. Maybe
it's my first GRL as an author.
Okay.
I was at Atlanta. It was my first experience there. I basically turned up with my one little book in hand, and nobody knew who I was. And so now, Kansas City, I'll be turning up with 3 books in hand with nobody knowing who I am. So yeah, it should be a lot of fun. Looking forward to it.
Awesome. Yeah, Atlanta seems like so long ago now. What are you looking forward to in Kansas City?
Specifically?
Sure.
Look, I've honestly tried not to pin expectations down that finely. I'm kind of it is just such a big event, particularly compared to the other, LGBT literary festivals out there. It's just so much on such a broader scale. You never end up having enough time to, spend with the people who you think you're going to hang out with, and you always meet new people and come away with new connections that way. I really sort of enjoy like just table one-on-ones with the readers. Like come see me in the salon. Hang out after my reading. I just have a chat. You don't even have to talk about the books. You don't have to have read the books. Come chat with me about movies. Come chat, whatever. I just enjoy listening to people and just hearing their various ideas on other authors, whether connected to my books or whatever. And I mean that's the big appeal with a lot of the cons is the way they open up the community to you. Particularly, I think sometimes this genre of community can feel very, very online. Feel very, very digital. I feel like we're a lot of the time kind of at the mercy and tyranny of the Amazon beast as it's grown. So it's really nice to sort of step away from this kind of one-click culture and actually, humanize the books and humanize the authors and the readers a little bit. So that's probably the aspect I'm looking most forward to. But yeah, I to be honest, I haven't even looked at the schedule in close detail. But yeah, I will be there. Come say hi. I don't bite unless you bribe appropriately.
Careful, you never know what'll happen at those after parties.
I have a pretty good idea, but yeah.
So what's coming up next for you? A book 3 in Arcadia Trust, I hope.
Yes, it's on the way. It's still there are still ideas being worked out and pieced together, and there is the introduction of a character who's had quite a strong influence on the first 2 books, but not yet appeared. So there's your little spoiler alert there. But yeah, I'm still hashing out a first draft to 3rd book in that series, and I'm working on a kind of a horror novella set in New Orleans that I've kind of been toing and froing on for a couple of years now. I'd probably struggle to pitch that as urban fantasy in any way. That's tipping over into the horror side of things. So if you like your genre commitment in that direction, it might be to your taste. I have notes kind of floating around on other things as well, but there's only so much you can sort of work on at once, and I don't write quickly. I applaud these authors who can turn out 10 books a year, but I'm not one of them. I don't know, maybe it's because I like having that overarching slower story. That's kind of what's on the way at the moment. Still very much within the fantasy speculative realm.
Cool. And what's the best way for people to keep up with you online?
Online, probably, there's my website, which is simply www.christianbaines.com. Facebook, just facebook.com/ChristianBainesAuthor. Twitter, again, it's @ChristianBaines, but it's spelt XTIANBAINES. I think I have a Goodreads page as well, and that's pretty much it. I don't do Instagram. I don't do Tumblr. I am appalling at blogging. I do have one. It does exist, but don't rely on it. I link it through to my Goodreads page anyway, so you can go there. But yeah, so I am findable.
Awesome. And we'll link up to all that stuff in our show notes, along with the links to the books, so people can go out and pick them up.
That would be fantastic.
Awesome. Well, Christian, thank you so much for being with us, and we look forward to seeing you in Kansas as well.
Thank you for having me. Feel free to come say hi.
Absolutely.